A peat cutter on the Jutland Peninsula in 1950 reached into the earth for fuel and found a face looking back at him. Not a skull. A face. Closed eyes. Stubble on the chin. A faint expression still readable after 2,500 years. The police were called. They assumed murder. They were wrong by 2.5 millennia. His name is Toland Mon. He was not alone. More than 500 BOG bodies have been recovered from Denmark's peat alone, dating between 800 BC and 200 AD. For decades, researchers could observe what the bogs had preserved: skin, hair, stomach contents. The noose still knotted around a throat. What they could not read was the deeper record, the genetic material. The isotopes embedded in hair like a geographic diary written in chemistry. When science finally caught up with what the peat had held, the story of Iron Age Europe had to be rewritten. The peat bog is not a dramatic landscape. It does not announce itself. It sits flat and dark across the Jutland Peninsula, covered in moss, largely featureless, unremarkable to anyone who does not know what happens inside it. What happens inside it is extraordinary. Peat is compressed, decomposed vegetation accumulated over centuries. As the moss dies in layers, it releases a molecule called sphagnum that halts bacterial growth. The water in a peat bog is acidic and almost entirely without oxygen. Fungi and bacteria, the organisms responsible for biological decay, cannot function in those conditions. Organic material submerged in peat does not rot in the way it would anywhere else. It is held, suspended in a state of arrested decomposition that can last for millennia. The same acidity that stops decay works differently on different biological materials. Soft tissue, skin, hair, internal organs, stomach contents survives. Calcium phosphate, the mineral compound of bone, dissolves. Many bog bodies recovered from Denmark retain their faces in extraordinary detail and have lost their skeletons almost entirely. The chemistry preserves the person and erases the skeleton simultaneously. It is one of the more unsettling paradoxes in all of archaeology. More than 500 Iron Age bog bodies and skeletal remains have been recovered from Denmark alone. Across northern Europe, the number runs into the thousands, with significant finds in Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. The majority date to the Iron Age, roughly 800 BC to 200 AD, a period spanning 1,000 years of northern European prehistory for which no written records exist on the Danish side. 3 individuals anchor the science that followed. Toland Man was found in 1950 in the Bjældskovdal bog in central Jutland by 2 brothers cutting peat for household fuel. His face was so well preserved that they called the police, convinced they had found a recent murder victim. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 405 and 380 BC. Grobaleman was found 2 years later, in 1952, in Nebelgard Bog, near the village of Grobal, also in Jutland. A peat cutter named Tage Busk Sorensen came across a tuft of red hair in the earth. There was a body attached to it. He initially assumed it was a local man who had vanished years earlier. It was not. The body belonged to a man who had died in the 3rd century BC. Huldrem. Woman was found in 1879 by a worker cutting peat near Ramton in northeastern Jutland. Unlike most bog bodies, she was fully clothed. She was approximately 40 years old. She had been in the peat for over 2,000 years and arrived at the surface still wearing her skirt. Each discovered by ordinary people doing ordinary work. Each so well preserved that murder was the first assumption. Each ancient, beyond what the eye could measure. For decades, the interpretive model that surrounded these bodies was straightforward. Iron Age communities in Jutland were understood as closed, locally bound, insular. People were born, lived, and died within a narrow geographic radius. The bogs were read as the burial grounds of the local community's unwanted criminals, outcasts, sacrificial victims drawn from the immediate population. The Roman historian Tacitus had written in 98 AD that the Germanic tribes drowned their disgraced in bogs beneath weighted hurdles. That account shaped the interpretation for generations. The bodies themselves complicated it from the beginning. The care shown to some of them was inconsistent with disposal. The preservation was inconsistent with any expectation. And locked inside the tissue was a record that no one in 1950 or 1879 possessed the tools to read. The science that could read it took another half-century to arrive. Toland man was found in a sleeping position. That detail matters. He was curled on his side, eyes closed, mouth closed, his leather cap secured under his chin with two thin straps. A plaited leather cord was wound around his neck. He was otherwise naked. The arrangement was not the posture of someone thrown into water. It was the posture of someone placed there. Forensic examination confirmed what the noose implied. He died by hanging. The cord had left furrows in the skin beneath his chin and along the sides of his neck. Radiography showed his tongue distended in the manner consistent with suspension. His cervical vertebrae were undamaged, which is common in hanging where the drop is short and death comes from asphyxiation rather than a broken neck. He was between 30 and 40 years old. He died somewhere between 405 and 380 BC. His last meal was examined in the 1950s and re-examined in 2021 with significantly improved methodology. It was a porridge. Barley, flax, fish, and pale persicaria, a weed that grows among barley crops but is routinely cleaned out during threshing. It is not food. It is the waste product of food preparation. Someone had added it deliberately. The same addition appears in the stomach contents of Graubalman, a detail present in two separate individuals, separated by over a century, suggests the pattern was intentional. A ritual ingredient, not an accidental one. Graubalman's death was less ambiguous in its physical character. His throat had been cut from ear to ear. The wound ran beneath his jawline in a single deep incision. Forensic re-examination confirmed it as the cause of death. His right shin had been broken shortly before he died. He was 34 years old. Electron microscopy analysis of his fingerprints revealed smooth skin, no calluses, no evidence of sustained physical labor. His last meal contained the remains of over 60 botanical components, wild grasses, cereal grains, seeds gathered from across the surrounding landscape, and traces of ergot fungus. The breadth of ingredients was not the profile of an ordinary winter meal. He died in winter or early spring. There were no fresh herbs or berries in his stomach. Huldremost's woman arrived at the surface, still dressed. That alone set her apart. Most bog bodies are found naked, either because they were deposited without clothing or because organic material had deteriorated over time. She was wearing a PLA'd wool skirt, originally dyed blue and purple, a red wool scarf fastened with a bird bone pin, 2 layered sheepskin capes with the fleece turned outward. Beneath all of it, impressions in her skin suggested a white undergarment made from plant fiber. A horn comb, a leather thong, and a wool headband were found in what appeared to be a pocket on the inner cape. She had a severed arm. The injury occurred at or around the time of death. Tacitus wrote that the Germanic tribes disposed of cowards and traitors in bogs, weighted beneath hurdles. That account became the default framework for understanding these deaths. It is not wrong exactly, but it is insufficient. Toland man's eyes were closed. His body was arranged. In Iron Age Denmark, cremation was the overwhelming norm. Placing a body intact into water rather than fire was not the treatment of refuse. It was a decision. The physical record of these 3 individuals consistently exceeds what a theory of criminal disposal can accommodate. Something else was happening in those bogs. The tissue held the evidence. The question was whether science could extract it. Karen Margareta Frey is a research scientist at the National Museum of Denmark. The tool she brought to the bog bodies was not genetic. It was geological. Strontium is an element present almost everywhere in nature. It occurs in soil, is absorbed by plants, and enters the bodies of animals and humans through eating and drinking. What makes it useful to archaeology is that its isotope ratio, specifically the proportion of strontium 87 to strontium 86, varies by geography. Volcanic regions produce one signature. Ancient Precambrian rock terrains produce another. The chalk and limestone platforms of Denmark produce another still. Eat and drink in one place long enough, and that signature embeds itself permanently in your teeth and bones. Hair records it sequentially. The root reflects recent months. The tip reflects years earlier. A long strand of hair is a geographic timeline written in chemistry. FAR-EI spent 3 years developing a technique for cleaning ancient hair samples and extracting usable strontium from them. The process had to eliminate contamination from the bog environment itself, which carries its own chemical signatures. When she finally had a reliable method, she applied it first to Holdremo's woman. The result divided cleanly into 2 separate stories. The strontium in Holdremo's woman's skin was consistent with local Jutland geology. She was from Denmark. That much aligned with every assumption the existing model would have predicted. Then FAR-EI examined the textiles. The plant fiber garment she wore beneath her wool clothing showed a strontium signature incompatible with any Danish terrain. It was consistent with geologically older Precambrian rock, the kind found across northern Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden. Her wool skirt told an even more complex story. It had been assembled from wool sourced from at least 3 distinct geographic regions. 1 was local, 2 were not. The fabric on her body had crossed Scandinavia before she died. The implications were immediate and significant. Iron Age Jutland at this period was not supposed to have extensive trade networks. The prevailing understanding held that Northern European cultures in the early Iron Age operated in relative isolation, with limited contact and limited exchange across long distances. Holdremo's woman's wardrobe was direct physical evidence against that position. Wool and plant fibers had moved across hundreds of kilometers. Someone had organized that movement. Frey then applied the same analysis to Harald's Care woman. Found in 1835, preserved well enough that she had once been mistakenly identified as a medieval Norwegian queen, Harald's Care woman had something no other bog body could offer. Her hair was 50 centimeters long. That is the longest strontium record recoverable from a single individual. It represented years of geographic movement embedded in a single strand. Her teeth told the first part of the story. The enamel, which forms in childhood, showed a strontium signature consistent with local Danish geology. She had grown up in Denmark. The tip of her hair told something entirely different. In the months before her death, the strontium signature shifted. It moved away from the Danish baseline toward a profile consistent with a volcanic region, central Germany, possibly the United Kingdom. She had been far from home when she died, or had returned from somewhere far away in the period immediately before her death. Both women had traveled. Both ended up in Danish bogs. Neither fit the model of a locally born criminal disposed of by her own community. Researcher Heather Gill Firking had proposed for years that bog bodies might be geographic outsiders, people who had married into communities from elsewhere, travelers, individuals who had not fully assimilated and were therefore not cremated in the local tradition when they died. The strontium said she was right, and it said something larger than that. The world these people moved through was not closed. It was connected in ways the existing history of Iron Age Europe had not accounted for. Strontium told researchers where the bog bodies had been. DNA would tell them who they actually were. The logic was straightforward. Genetic material would confirm geographic origin at the population level, identify ancestral lineages, establish whether individuals were local or foreign at the deepest biological level, and potentially reveal what Iron Age Scandinavians looked like and where their ancestors had come from. DNA traced movement across a single lifetime. DNA traced descent across generations. Together they would produce a picture that neither could produce alone. The problem was the biog itself. The same acidic chemistry that preserved Tolland man's face dissolved his DNA. Acidity, moisture, microbial activity, and simple chemical time all work against genetic material. The conditions that made the Danish peat bogs exceptional for soft tissue preservation made them among the most hostile environments on Earth for ancient DNA recovery. Researchers working in Siberian permafrost or arid desert sites had extracted ancient genetic sequences with relative reliability. Denmark was neither. The peat was wet, warm by comparison, and acidic throughout. Nobody expected usable DNA to survive in those conditions. The petroous bone at the base of the skull is the densest bone in the human body. It protects the inner ear, and in doing so, it protects whatever genetic material survives inside it better than any other skeletal structure. In ancient DNA research, it is the sample of last resort and first choice simultaneously. If DNA exists anywhere in a degraded specimen, it is most likely there. Researchers took samples from Tolland man's femur first. The attempt failed. The genetic material in the thigh bone was too degraded, too fragmented, too chemically attacked by the bog environment to produce readable sequences. The femur was a dead end. The petroous bone remained the target, but drilling into the most extraordinarily preserved skull in European archaeology was not a decision anyone took lightly. Peter de Barros Damgaard and Morten Allentoft from Copenhagen's Center for Geogenetics turned to Harald's Kyer woman, a tooth and a section of petroous bone. After almost a full year of laboratory work, the tooth yielded a fragment so small that contamination could not be ruled out. 0.2% human DNA. Damgaard described the genetic puzzle as broken into pieces so small they carried no information. The DNA of Harald's Kyer woman, he concluded, was beyond reach forever. This is the specific obstacle that makes the bog bodies different from almost every other ancient DNA project. The same chemistry that preserved the faces erased the genes. The bogs gave with one hand and took with the other. The solution was scale. If individual bog bodies could not yield clean genetic sequences, the population they belonged to could still be read. Allentoft and colleagues assembled data sets, not from bog bodies specifically, but from Iron Age skeletal remains across multiple burial sites throughout Denmark, sites where bone had been preserved in conditions less hostile to DNA than acidic peat. Iron Age villages, burial mounds, cemetery sites across Jutland and the Danish islands, thousands of individuals, dozens of sites. The genetic record of the population that placed those bodies in the bogs. The contamination problem that had defeated the individual extractions became manageable at population scale. Patterns that disappeared in a single degraded sample became legible across hundreds of samples. The methodology that had failed on Tolland man's femur succeeded when applied systematically across the broader Iron Age world he had inhabited. What that methodology returned was not a footnote. It was a complete revision of who Iron Age Scandinavians actually were, where they had come from, and what the society burying its dead in Danish peat had already been through before the first bog body was ever placed in the water. The DNA did not describe the people anyone expected to find. The working assumption embedded in a century of Iron Age archaeology was straightforward. The people of Jutland were ancient Scandinavians, rooted in the peninsula across deep time, a population continuous with the landscape they inhabited. The bog bodies were their local dead, locals executed, locals sacrificed, locals disposed of by the communities that had always lived in this specific place. The genetics dismantled that assumption completely. The Iron Age population of Denmark was not a single ancient lineage with unbroken roots in Jutland soil. It was the product of at least two major prehistoric migrations that had converged, mixed, and layered over one another across thousands of years before the Iron Age began. The people who hanged Tolland man, who cut Graubaal man's throat, who placed Holdremos woman in the peat, still wearing her traveling clothes, they were themselves the descendants of migrants. The first genetic layer was Neolithic. Around 3,900 BC, farming arrived in Denmark, carried by agricultural communities, moving northward through Europe. These farmers replaced or absorbed the hunter-gatherer populations that had inhabited the peninsula before them and became the genetic foundation of the Danish population. The second layer was more dramatic. During the Bronze Age, populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea, moved westward and northward across Europe in migrations that ancient DNA has now traced with precision. They carried a distinct ancestral profile that transformed the genetic composition of northern Europe. By the time the Iron Age began, the population of Jutland already carried substantial steppe ancestry layered over its Neolithic base. Tollund man, Grobal man, Huldremose woman. None of them were the product of an ancient, unchanging Scandinavian bloodline. They were the living outcome of migrations stretching back through the Bronze Age to the grasslands of Central Asia. The genetic record said so directly. The haplogroup data sharpened the picture further. Haplogroup I, present at less than 2% in modern Scandinavian populations, appeared at significantly elevated rates across Iron Age Danish burial sites. Several haplogroups common in the ancient record are rare or absent in present-day Denmark. The genetic composition of the Iron Age population was measurably different from the population that occupies the same geography today. The people in the bogs belong to a genetic world that has itself since been transformed by further movements and mixtures across the centuries that followed. Physical appearance followed from the genetics and broke from the stereotype directly. The Iron Age Scandinavian population was not the uniformly fair, blue-eyed demographic that later Norse imagery projects backward onto the ancient world. The ancient DNA indicated a population with considerably more variation in pigmentation. Lighter coloring was increasing through the Iron Age, but earlier individuals showed a broader range. The iconic image of the ancient Norseman was a later simplification applied retrospectively to a more complex reality. Then the population genetics and the strontium were placed side by side, and the combined picture resolved into something that rewrote the foundational assumptions of Iron Age European history. Huldremose woman was locally born, her genetics confirmed it, but she wore textiles assembled from wool crossing multiple Scandinavian regions, and she belonged to a population that was itself the product of continental migration. Haraldskær woman had grown up in Denmark genetically and geographically, but she had traveled to a volcanic region hundreds of kilometers away in her final months, and the Iron Age world she returned to was already ancient, layered, and far from closed. The society that placed these people in the bogs was connected across Europe in ways nobody had predicted. The DNA of their population proved it. The strontium in their hair confirmed it. The textiles on their bodies demonstrated it. What the bogs held was not an isolated backwater performing mysterious rites at the edge of the known world. It was a fully embedded node in a network that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the coasts of Britain. The peat preserved the evidence. The DNA finally made it readable. Both things were true simultaneously. They always are. The violence in the Danish bogs was real, deliberate, and forensically legible across 2,000 years of preservation. Grobal man's throat cut from ear to ear. Tollund man hanged with a pleated leather cord still knotted at his neck. Huldremose woman's arm severed at or around the time of her death. These were not accidents. They were not drownings. They were executions, carried out with precision and purpose by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The care was equally real and equally deliberate. Tollund man's eyes were closed after death. His body was arranged on its side in a position that required someone to place him there with attention. The leather cap remained on his head. In a period when cremation was the overwhelming norm for the dead, his intact body was lowered into water and left. That is not disposal. That requires a decision about what this particular death meant and what it deserved. The ritual last meal connects them further. The threshing waste added to Tollund man's porridge appears again in Grobal man's stomach. A weed routinely discarded during grain processing, present in two separate individuals across more than a century of time. The repetition is not coincidence, it is pattern. Someone in Iron Age Jutland understood that a specific kind of death required a specific kind of final meal, and that understanding persisted across generations. Tacitus wrote that the bogs were places of disposal for the degraded and the deviant. cowards drowned beneath weighted hurdles, traitors submerged and forgotten. That account has shaped the interpretation of bog bodies for generations, and it is not entirely wrong. Execution and bog deposition were connected in Iron Age Northern Europe. The written record confirms it. But Tacitus was a Roman writing about people he had never met, translating practices he did not fully understand into the moral framework of an empire that considered these communities barbaric. His account is a starting point. It is not an ending. The archaeological record says something considerably more complex. Weapons were deposited in Danish bogs. Cauldrons, gold ornaments, slaughtered animals, broken tools. These were not refuse. They were offerings. Objects of value deliberately placed at the boundary between the visible world and whatever was understood to lie beyond it. The bog was not a rubbish ground. It was a threshold. If weapons and gold were offerings, the people deposited alongside them require a different interpretive frame than criminal disposal. The care shown to Toland man's body is not inconsistent with sacrifice. It may be the clearest evidence of it. A criminal thrown into water does not have his eyes closed. A sacrifice might. The strontium evidence adds the final layer. Both Holdremos woman and Haraldskær woman had been traveling before their deaths, moving between communities, existing in the space between one world and another. Liminal figures. People who were not fully of the local community, who had not assimilated, who carried the geography of elsewhere in their hair and their clothing. In many ritual traditions across human cultures, the figure chosen for sacrifice is selected precisely because they exist at a boundary, not fully inside, not fully outside, closer to the threshold than anyone else. The bogi was the threshold. The people placed in it may have been chosen because they already stood near it. Criminal execution and ritual sacrifice are not mutually exclusive categories. A society can condemn someone and consider them sacred simultaneously. The bog held both possibilities in the same body, in the same knotted cord, in the same closed eyes. The science made the violence legible. It did not make it simple. It was never going to. Return to that face. Toland man's closed eyes, the stubble on his chin, the faint expression that stopped two peat cutters in 1950 and made them reach for a telephone. He has been the most famous mystery in European prehistory for 70 years, preserved beyond any reasonable expectation, illegible beyond what the eye alone could see. The strontium in Haraldskær woman's hair placed her hundreds of kilometers from home in the months before her death. The genetics across the Iron Age population revealed a society already shaped by migrations nobody had predicted. The textiles on Holdremos woman's body had crossed Scandinavia before she did. What the bogs preserved was not a closed world of isolated communities performing inscrutable rites in a forgotten darkness. It was a connected Europe, already old and complicated and moving, long before anyone wrote it down. The peat held the evidence. The science read it. The questions it opened are not finished yet.